Chapter 88, Feng Jian and the Boy. Yesterday's peach slice cake gave Zhou Baoying half of it. Jiang Xuning was still a little depressed when she thought about it. She lowered her head and lowered her eyes and followed Xie Wei into the side hall. Xie Wei didn't look at her either, only pointed to the piano table in the hall indifferently, and said, "Let's practice." At this time, Jiang Xuning didn't notice it yet. Xie Wei never spoke much, and she didn't say a word, she was used to it. "Last time, I was not quiet, but this time I was a little quieter." After sitting down and playing, she felt good and wanted to hear what Xie Wei had to say. Unexpectedly, when listening to the piano, Xie Wei looked out the window the whole time, until the sound of the piano was exhausted. Then he turned his head to look at her, and said, "When I started, my heart was too floating, and I played it in a hurry, and the middle section was slightly better, and the end floated again." Often, after you feel satisfied, you quickly become unsatisfied. Practice makes perfect, or be more familiar and quieter. Jiang Xuning glanced at her fingers thoughtfully. Xie Wei said, "The finger hook is too fast, the string tone is urgent, and you have to wait until the aftermath of the previous rhyme is about to end." So, Jiang Xuning finally faintly noticed. But this discovery has nothing to do with Jean. It's only about Xie Wei. He doesn't always smile, and the little smile in his eyes is often polite, but his eyebrows and eyes only need to be softened for half a minute, and it always makes people feel like a spring breeze. Impeccable perfection. But in this side hall, he would frown, and he would scold her with a cold smile when there was no one else. Today, however, everything fades. It's not cold, it's just light. Although her words and deeds didn't seem to be different from usual, Jiang Xuning always felt as if she was a little more estranged, as if she was separated by a layer. The idea came too quickly and too directly. She didn't even have time to sort out where the feeling came from, let alone what clues were there. Thoughts flew, and in the blink of an eye, he returned to the piano. Zheng. Jiang Xuning tried again according to Xie Wei's instructions, but it was worse than just now, and she couldn't do it. She looked at him a little bewildered. The girl's gaze was a little confused, as if she wanted to ask him something more, but she didn't dare to speak. Xie Wei thought that she seemed to have always been like this, and she was a little afraid of herself. It's always useless to talk about learning the piano. He moved to Jiang Xuning's side, gently put the book on the edge of her piano table, and subconsciously leaned over to put his fingers on the strings. However, when he leaned over, the wide-sleeved robe fell beside the girl's slender arm, and he paused. The peach cake came back to his mind. Who did she think of him? Or what does he think of himself? His expression did not change. Xie Wei directly reached out and moved the piano to the side. The distance with Jiang Xuning widened. With his eyes closed, he raised his finger and hooked the strings to play the part of Fang Cai, and then he returned the piano to her and said, "Try again." This time it was closer, and it was clear to hear. Jiang Xuning probably understood. She gave it a try, and sure enough, it got a lot better. Just raised her eyes to look at the figure of Xie Wei walking past the piano table, but she felt more and more that the feeling that had just crossed her heart was not an illusion. Restraint, detachment. This feeling of keeping a distance, whether it is compared to the smiling scolding in the past, or compared to the ear in the past, it stands to reason that it will make her a lot easier. After all, she wanted to be far away from the beginning. But right now, while relaxing, I feel that something is wrong. But when I think about it in detail, I don't know what is wrong. If this short day may have been her illusion, then in the next few days, this illusion has gradually deepened into a real perception. It's really sparse. The text is the same, the piano is the same teaching, Xie Wei is still the usual Xie Wei, or the Xie Wei that everyone is familiar with in the Manchu dynasty. But he didn't have any temper, Jiang Xuning didn't even dare to show the few willful stubbornness in the face of him. There were no more pastries and snacks to eat in the side hall, and he almost didn't even make tea, let alone ask her to drink it like the previous times. What is this feeling? It's like a person taking a step back, going back to where they were. Jiang Xuning was not very comfortable for no reason, nor was she very comfortable. Her instincts told her that something must have happened secretly when she didn't know it, or maybe she had inadvertently done something wrong, but there was so much contact between the two that she really couldn't remember. Every time I wanted to ask Xie Wei what was going on, I felt hypocritical. Obviously, everything looks the same, so where does she start? In addition, the day of the Yanji Haofu Yan's crown ceremony is getting closer, and Jiang Xuning gradually let go of the things next to him, and he doesn't have too much thought to think about it. In the previous life, she prepared a birthday gift for Yan Lin, but in the end she couldn't send it out. In this life, she prepared the same congratulatory gift, hoping only to make up for the regrets of the previous life and put it in the hands of the young man. When she went out of the palace to rest again, Jiang Xuning didn't even have time to ask Yu Fangyin how things were going, so she ordered someone to go to the sword casting workshop in the west of the city. In the book, it is always written that the sword should pick out the master. But in fact, those who can really forge a good sword are just craftsmen, and the sword is never chosen by anyone, and those who can make a lot of money are masters. Obviously, this second girl Jiang, who they don't know each other, is such a master with a lot of money. Asterisk. As early as half a year ago, the crown ceremony of the little Marquis of Yanji Ho's mansion Yanlin has attracted most of the capital's eagerness. I don't know how many beautiful people are waiting for the day when the young man is crowned and takes the word, and the icemen who are talking about matchmaking everywhere have prepared the roster early, just waiting for the crown ceremony to break the threshold of the Ho mansion. However, no one expected the current situation. However, just half a year has passed, and the Yanji Marquis mansion, which was once prominent and worthy of the Xiao family, is already in danger, and there is a risk that the mansion will become a prisoner at any time. In the past, everyone was going around to drill camps, lest he would not be invited when the little Marquis crowned and would be ridiculed by the capital. Now it is a gilded invitation distributed to all the mansions, either closed or not returned, for fear that it will have something to do with the Ho mansion and cause trouble. People are warm and cold, but that's the case. Except for Jiang Xuning, all the companions in Yang's Hizai have no personal relationship with Yan Lin, and most of them originally sought advantages and avoided disadvantages and did not plan to go. Can't stand Shenzai to go. Not only did she have to go, but she also had to go openly and with great fanfare. Everyone was the eldest princess's companion, and when they heard Shenzai say that they were going, they hesitated a little, and then they heard Xiao Shu say that they were going, and the rest of them were all put on the fire, and it was not good not to go. As soon as the big guys discussed, they simply accompanied Shenzai together. In this way, if something happens in the future, it has nothing to do with the family behind them, it's just that they are a group of little girls accompanying Her Royal Highness the eldest princess. Therefore, on the 8th day of the first month of November, everyone rode together in a car, set off from the palace, and went to the palace of the Marquis of Yanji. Shenzai originally said that she wanted to go with Jiang Xuning, but before leaving, she was called by Empress Dowager Xiao, so she had to let them go first and come later. This time, Jiang Xuning happened to be in the same car with Zhou Baoying. After the last borrowing pastries, the relationship between the two has become a lot closer. But Chen Chuyi, Yao Shi and others seemed to mind Zhou Baoying's good impression of Jiang Xuning, as if they were afraid that this little girl would be abducted by her vixen, regardless of whether they were studying in Fengchen Hall or in Yang's Hizai for a small gathering. They all dragged Zhou Baoying and were very wary of Jiang Xuning. Zhou Baoying was also confused, and it didn't seem to matter to these. Anyway, if you have something to eat in your mouth and a chess game in your hand, You can sit all day without hearing anything outside the window with both ears. This time they were actually in the same car, and Zhou Baoying danced happily for a while. After all, the peach slice cake last time was too memorable. As soon as she got in the car, she hugged the big pillow, and Baba asked Zhang Xuning, "Sister Ning, they don't let me talk to you, and they don't let me come to you, they've almost killed me these days. This is really a pot that can't be opened." Zhang Xuning has been talking about it for several days. It's a pity that this is neither done by her, nor by her cook, nor by the imperial dining room in the palace. Xie Wei has never mentioned any other topics other than learning piano and literature these days, as if there is indeed no side relationship between him and Zhang Xuning, except for the teacher-student relationship. But this also seems to be true. Therefore, Zhang Xuning didn't dare to ask anything more and more, for fear that something wrong would anger him, or he would be too eager for the things he wanted, causing him to think of the old things and be afraid of her. At this moment, she was sitting in the car, also a little helpless, smiled faintly, and replied to Zhou Baoying, "No, just that, after giving half of it to you, I will eat the rest." Zhou Baoying's little face suddenly collapsed. She frowned sadly and complained in a low voice, "I knew this was the case, when Mr. Xie took it away, I shouldn't have been so generous. I didn't even eat a few slices myself." "Mr. Xie." Zhang Xuning was suddenly stunned. "Mr. Xie, you say?" Zhou Baoying nodded, looking a little dazed, and then pursed her mouth and became aggrieved, and said, "Sister Ning, you don't know, I took back a few pieces of the peach slice cake you gave me last time, and the rest of the ones were counted before going to bed at night before they were put into paper bags, and I wanted to keep them for the next day. As a result, I didn't expect to be bumped into by Mr. Xie when I secretly ran outside the palace to eat the next day." Zhang Xuning finally realized where she was wrong. Zhou Baoying's bun face was still a little puffy. "I didn't expect that Mr. Xie would be such a person. He asked about the peach cake, and I couldn't help but answer. Before entering the palace to study, my father also taught him to respect the teacher, so I asked him to taste it. I thought he would only take one piece, but he knew that he had taken the rest and asked me what was wrong." Zhang Xuaning's long eyelashes fell, and she was in a trance for a while. The horse's hooves clattered, and the carriage swayed gently. The things that had been sealed in the old memories of her previous life suddenly became clear in the fog. The gentleman cooks far away, just like some women are not allowed to enter the ancestral hall, which is one of the strictest rules of the family. Xie Wei is a gentleman and a saint. But at that time, she was just a country girl, she didn't know his identity, nor did she understand the rules of this Lishize, and after listening to what the people in the mansion said who came to pick her up, she never doubted it, just that he was really a distant cousin young master who went to the capital to go to Jiang's mansion. After encountering the bandits, they wandered between the mountains and wilderness, not knowing from anyone else, or even how to get out of their predicament. The mountains and valleys are like a prisoner. At that time, Xie Wei was not seriously ill, he only looked a little weak, and he was accompanied by a cough that he had since he first traveled to Beijing with her. Zhang Xuning already knew that she was the concubine of the Zhang mansion. The other party is just a distant relative who can't beat each other together. She was afraid that others would think that she was a country girl who would lose face when she entered Beijing, and she was also afraid that others would look down on her because of this, so she still wanted to summon her to thank him even if she was in trouble, and told him to pick some wild fruits to eat and hunt some prey to satisfy his hunger. The result, of course, is immovable. Since falling into the predicament, Xie Wei has held his piano on his lap and sat on the collapsed mountain rock, watching the dimming sky between the mountains. He couldn't seem to hear any of the voices beside him. In fact, he seemed to be thinking about something more serious than falling into trouble, as if he had entered another world. But Zhang Xuning couldn't understand it at that time, but this person didn't give himself face, so he was still a little annoyed. I had no choice but to go by myself. Of course, this is not very good. But Jiang Xuning had no other way at that time, and she forced herself to find a good reason for her head. This succeedling looked like she was about to fall after walking 2 steps, not to mention going out to catch some pheasants and hares, just going out to pick some wild fruits. Maybe she could break her leg in the forest if she stumbled, and then she would have to think about how to carry this person along? That can't be road. So I quickly adjusted my mentality. So the skills of those nobles in the Grange who seemed to be very unpopular in Beijing finally came in handy. There is no fruit in the mountains and forests in winter. But she tossed a trap with her hands and feet, and was lucky enough to catch a stupid gray-haired hare, and carried it all the way back to the bottom of the rock. The stupid rabbit in the mountains has never seen anyone, and when he was first caught, he was still fluttering desperately. But Jiang Xuning was comfortable in her arms, and it stayed in her arms safely after a while. She couldn't help but happily show off to Xie Wei, who was sitting above. "Look! The rabbit I caught, is it good?" Xie Wei heard the voice, and finally turned his head to look at her, and also glanced at the rabbit in her arms. There was a super dusty indifference in his eyes, and maybe even a little pity. Jiang Xuning also reached out to touch its soft fur. Xie Wei asked her calmly, "Do you want to make a fire?" At that moment, her whole body stiffened. Blinked, looking at Xie Wei, and couldn't come back to his senses. Because, it wasn't until Xie Wei asked this sentence that she suddenly remembered, this rabbit was caught for the sake of satisfying her stomach, and she and Xie Wei hadn't eaten for some time. Very hungry, very hungry. She stood there and didn't answer. Xie Wei waited for her for a while, and when it was dark, he probably knew that she couldn't answer, so he didn't ask again, but carefully put the piano in a corner that was not protected from wind and rain, and then walked to the side to collect firewood and make a fire. The fire was lit. The temperature around her gradually rose, and the light of the fire, which was not very hot, soaked in the thick inky night, and shook and threw herself on the ground as she held the rabbit and did not let go. Xie Wei stood in front of her. He was much higher than him. The light of the fire beside him was reflected on his face, and there were different shades depending on the depth of the outline, and a pair of dark pupils gathered the light, and he only stretched out his hand to her to take the rabbit. Jiang Xuning subconsciously hugged a little tighter, raised her head and looked at him and said, If we don't eat anything else, I'll go and fight something else." Xie Wei looked at her silently. "Then are you willing to eat next?" She stood there, stunned, not knowing what to answer. Xie Wei's hand still reached over. She hugged the rabbit so hard that she didn't want to give it to him. But she was so hard that she hurt the rabbit, and it actually bit the back of her hand, and it hurt so much that she let go of it. It scurried into Xie Wei's hands. He took out a short knife from his wide-sleeved robe, which was tightly tied to his wrist. At that time, Jiang Xuning knew that this person had a knife on him. Now think about it, what kind of sick and weak young master from afar, a scholar who has no power to tie a chicken, what kind of knife does he carry with him? But whoever has a knife hidden in his body walks on the most dangerous road, ready for any accident at any time. But at that time, she was still stupid and didn't know how to think about it. Xie Wei grabbed the rabbit tightly, pressed it on the stone next to it, and was about to use the knife. But she stood by and shivered. "It's probably red-eyed." Xie Wei saw that the movements of his hands stopped, and after a while, he finally didn't say a word, and walked away with the rabbit. When he returned, the stupid rabbit that was still alive had been skinned, eviscerated, and put on sharpened branches, and lightly set up on the fire. The man even found some wild leaves and spices to sprinkle. Jiang Xuning hugged her knees, sat by the fire, and bit her sleeve so that she didn't shed tears. Xie Wei roasted the rabbit, broke a rabbit leg and handed it to her. When she saw it, The skin of the rabbit leg was golden, and it was oozing out of the fat that had been roasted by the heat, stained with some unknown spices, and the thin part of the meat that was torn apart was one by one, and finally she couldn't hold back and cried out with a wow. Crying until choking, crying until hiccups, crying until out of breath. Siawei also has nothing to do with her. No one picked up the rabbit leg that stretched out, and she was not very familiar with her, and she didn't know how to persuade her, so she had to put her hand back and eat it without waves next to her. I ate a small half and saw that she was still crying. He stopped, looked at her for a moment, and then took a clean towel in his bosom, opened it and put it next to her. There were a few petals of peach slice cake. It's just not much, in my arms, wrapped in a handkerchief, and crushed a lot. It doesn't look very good. Siawei said to her, if you can't eat it, eat this. Jiang Xuning was still hungry after all. She also knew that the rabbit had to eat, but when she thought of it obediently curled up in her arms, she didn't want to eat it, and she didn't dare to eat it. Although she couldn't get used to seeing this sick seedling relative from afar before, she still picked up the handkerchief and picked up the peach cake inside to eat. It was the best pastry she'd ever had in her life. Sweet and soft. Even if there were tears mixed in it, I didn't feel the pain. But after all, there is only that. After eating, it evokes the feeling of hunger even more. So I got angry. Chi himself is a spineless person. In the end he still took the other rabbit leg handed by Siawei, while continuing to cry, while gnawing on the rabbit meat that was roasted just right, and sobbing to find a reason for himself. Who told it to dare to bite me? Siawei looked at the fire quietly beside him, and seemed to laugh, and then he disappeared and didn't speak. At that time, the fire had been burning for a long time. The pine branches that were thrown into it had a thin popping sound. Jiang Xuning actually didn't remember much about the smell of the rabbit, but she still remembered the soft and sweet taste of the peach slice cake, and Siawei's clean white clothes fell to the ground, stained with some smoke and dust, staining some black. In a desperate situation, many things are not taken care of. Can do things that you don't usually dare to do, and can say things that you don't usually say. People may not be the same as usual. In the face of life and death, everyone peels off the layers of hypocrisy when they live in the world, revealing their truest and ugliest sides. But is it true that people who are trying to survive in a brief desperate situation? Or is it true that the people who work hard in the glitzy and earthly camps? Jiang Xuning really didn't know. Zhou Baoying saw that she didn't speak for a long time, and she didn't know whether she was happy or sad. She was inexplicably a little apprehensive in her heart. She was afraid that she had done something wrong, so she carefully pulled her sleeve and asked, "Yes, is there something wrong?" Jiang Xuning's eyes moved, and only then did she come back to her senses. She curled her lips as if out of nowhere, sighed softly in a faint voice, and said, "It's okay. Siawei, this person, the eyes of the heart are really smaller than the tip of a needle." The coachman who was driving the horse in front stopped the carriage and bowed inside. "Second Miss Jiang, the sword casting workshop has arrived." Jiang Xuning said to Zhou Baoying, "I'm going down to pick up things, you wait for a while." Zhou Baoying said oh and sat obediently in the car waiting for her. The people in the swordsmithing workshop knew that she was coming to fetch the sword today, and they had already prepared properly. The sword was 3 feet and 2 feet long. The blade of the sword was made of meteoric iron, polished into a wave of blades, not decorated with gems, cast with gold and silver like the sword Yanlin used before, but it was so simple and straightforward to show its edge. As soon as Qingfeng came out, the cold light was pressing. In the previous life, she didn't know the depth of the world. She just thought that Yanlin was born in the general's door, and he would also lead troops to fight in the future, and he should have a sword to kill. In this life, all the ups and downs have passed like smoke and dust, and looking at this sword again, it reveals a kind of timely and tragic cruelty. How much do you think about that young man, who will always be as bright as the sun in the past? But God doesn't allow it. Jackals who secretly show their fangs are not allowed. After the swordsmith showed her the sword, he put it in the box and handed it to Jiang Xuning with both hands. She unconsciously hugged it diagonally as if she were holding a harp. But when I got out of the door and got to the carriage, I remembered that the sword case was not a piano, and it had to be laid flat.
星号
Due to a delay in the sword casting workshop, Jiang Xuning and Zhou Baoying's carriage arrived at the Yanji Marquis mansion at the right time. Probably because of today's Yan Lingguan ceremony, the heavy soldiers who originally besieged the mansion retreated to both sides. At first glance, it doesn't look so scary. There were not many guests who came, but there were not so few. They were all in front of the door, and they were handed over one by one, and they were led in by the smiling butler, as if there was no difference from when the home mansion was prominent in the past. Shenzai set off from the palace, but arrived at about the same time as Jiang Xuning. As soon as he lifted the curtain and saw her, he shouted, "Ning Ning." Jiang Xuning got out of the car holding the sword box. Shenzai jumped out of the car directly, regardless of the frightened faces of the palace people who were waiting. She walked over and pulled Jiang Xuning and ran to the gate of the home mansion. "Let's go, let's see Yan Lin go." Who doesn't know her? None of them stepped forward to stop her, and they all made way for her. She also asked the person waiting next to her, "Where is Yan Lin now?" The housekeeper laughed, and his face looked very kind. "The prince is talking to His Royal Highness King Yanping outside Qingyu Hall." Shenzai knew the direction. Yanji Haofu. She came to the mansion many times when she was a child. She could walk with her eyes closed, and she didn't even want to stop for half a minute at the moment, so she pulled Jiang Xuning to run and run, bypassing the shadow wall, passing through the hall, walking through the corridor, and finally saw someone outside the Qingyu Hall near the water. Shenzai then stretched out her hand and waved it over there, shouting loudly, "Yan Lin." The people over there all looked at it. The young man who was standing under the waterside porch with his back to them was being straightened out by Qing Feng for him, and when he heard the voice, he turned his head and followed the voice, and when he saw that it was them, his originally flat eyebrows and eyes suddenly rose like morning stars, scorching and fierce, and extremely bright. Yan Lin first smiled at Shenzai and said, "You also come to join in the fun." After speaking, his eyes fell on the man beside her. Shenzai turned her head and saw that Jiang Xuning was still standing there in a daze, so she pushed her, and Jiang Xuning was pushed 2 steps forward, and stood in front of the young man a little caught off guard and at a loss. Some days are gone, and the silhouette of the boy is getting clearer and clearer, and it is more sharp than before. But when looking at her, everything softened. "You're here too." The word Ning Ning, which was originally the most intimate, was quietly buried in his heart by him, but he didn't want to call her second Miss Jiang like others, so he simply greeted her like this. The situation of the home mansion is in danger, and this moment seems to be gone. He lowered his eyes to the box she was holding, smiled and asked her, "What is this?" Jiang Xuning only reacted at this time. After a lifetime of life and death, she finally held the sword box in both hands and handed it to the young man, looked at him, and smiled back at him. "Birthday gift. For you. I wanted to give it to you in my last life. May you always be like this sword."